Ladies and gentlemen, welcome everyone. My name is Balázs Jarábik. I'm from the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. We're waiting for one more panelist who is actually here, Pavel, Daneyko, and we will be ready to start right away. That would be great. It's really an honor for me to moderate this panel for various reasons. Because we have been talking about this with Ben Slay and Alexander Chubrik for years, B, because Ben Slay actually wrote a paper which is called the Minsk Consensus, and our focus have been always, where the global trends of where capitalism globally going, and where the Belarus, we don't want to call it model, but the Belarus example fits in. And we really have an excellent panel of senior representatives of essentially all the important international organizations here. And plus Pavel Daneyko, who is from Belarus, who is one of the most original thinkers and economists to reflect on these things. And yesterday when I was preparing to moderate this panel, I'm not an economist. So for me it's an honor, but at the same time I'm also a bit nervous about these things. But yesterday I was searching for certain things and I found an excellent, fresh presentation of Joseph Stiglitz about where the capitalism has been or is going. And it was incredibly timely, and if you don't mind, bear with me for a few minutes. So I'm going to read a few points of Stiglitz, who is a Nobel laureate of economics. Actually, we were trying to invite him for the forum several times, but he didn't materialize. So I think it would be important to go through for a few of the points. So Stiglitz is saying, capitalism has been not working well for large parts of the population. There is enormous growth in inequality, especially in the United States. There is a virtual stagnation for majority of citizens. Multiply dimension of inequality: health, wealth, opportunity. That's slide number one. Slide number two, cannot reconcile increase in inequality and other puzzles of the modern economy through the lens of competitive market. He says what is crucial is the growth of rents and not the growth of the economy. And the key to understand the growth of rent is how the rules of the market economy have been rewritten in the last third of the century. He also obviously tackled the issue of global inequality, but what I would like to continue 2 more points. He's rethinking of the standard economic theory. He says the growth has been anemic, the benefit of that growth goes to the top, the trickle-down economics hasn't worked. In the US, there has been near stagnation for the bottom of 90% of the century, and the American style of capitalism has been not working for the large fraction for the American people. He names among the many mysteries the high profit and the low investment. The wealth-income ratio is up, but the capital-income ratio is down in the US. There is insufficient savings to sustain the capital output ratio, which in results came the declining share of capital income as well as labor income. But he says even in the countries with higher savings like France, there is huge gap between the wealth and capital, and he explains that the gap is the rents. He also says there is a causal link. The saving goes to the increases into the capitalized value of rents, for instance, land and increased value of equity of rent exploitation firms. He also says that not just the share of labor that is down, but also the share of capital, and again, what is up is in the rents. Now, and 2 more points. He is explaining the increase in monopoly rents with several factors, and one of them is technology. He says the network externalities have created a new natural monopolies, and these 21st century natural monopolies are not regulated. The high tech has learned how to exploit and hoard data, and we all know that not oil, but data is the new oil. The big data is the new oil. He also explaining the increase in monopoly rents with rewriting the rules. He says changes in the rules of the game, failing to adapt the rules of the game to a changing world, new interpretation of old rules, and law enforcement. And very importantly, another tweet from Francis Fukuyama actually explaining this with state capture. Fukuyama says that there is outrageous that up until now there is no major institutions, accounting firm, law firms, who lost its license to operate in any leading Western country as a result of felonious behavior during the global economic crisis. Fukuyama compares this with the saving and loan banking crisis in the late 80s, which was saying the crisis is only 1/70th of the global financial crisis in the 2080, and that in the 80s led to 30,000 criminal referrals by the US bank regulators and thousands of felony convictions in US bankers. So, this is a quite gloomy picture about the capitalism and the global level, and particularly in the United States. So, we have an excellent panel, as I mentioned, and just quickly naming them. Ben Slay, who is from the UNDP, regional director, if I'm not mistaken, or a regional advisor, senior advisor. Then we have Buzz Bakker, a regional representative for Eastern Europe, Eastern and Central Europe from the IMF, Buzz Bakker. And we have Karlis Smits, who is a senior economist of the World Bank for Belarus and Ukraine. And last but absolutely not least, Pavel Daneyko from the Institute, director of the Institute of Privatization and Management in Belarus. What I would like to ask you, gentlemen, is a quick 7 minutes presentation, your thoughts on where the capitalism is at this current circumstances and where Belarus fits into this. Ben, let's start with that.
Thank you very much, Balázs. Well, Mr. Moderator, dear colleagues, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to begin by thanking the organizers of this forum for the chance to come back and participate. Forward-looking approaches that focus on sustainable development, as Slava Shidigeka just pointed out, are exactly what we need right now, both in Belarus and globally. I would like to take just a few minutes to briefly explain what the Minsk Consensus is or might be. In so doing, I should emphasize that these are personal reflections and ideas. They do not seek to represent the views of UNDP, the United Nations, or its member states. I would like to try to explain what the Minsk Consensus might be through 9 theses. And the first group of them begin by pointing out that if we look at the fate of other consensuses, like the Washington Consensus or the Beijing Consensus, a number of lessons present themselves. My first thesis would be is that consensus in some respect is a misnomer, because there is not universal agreement about these things. Instead, really the opposite would be true. Nothing has been more controversial than the idea of the Washington Consensus, for example. What these consensuses really represent when they work well is that they capture a certain synthesis or convergence of ideas that produces greater clarity or understanding that can helpfully simplify without oversimplification. Linked to this, and this is my second thesis, is that such consensuses can easily be misunderstood and reduced to caricature. If we read John Williamson's lamentations about the polemical oversimplification and confusion that followed his original presentation of the Washington Consensus, we can see the logic of such concerns. My third thesis would be there need not be a close link between the location that is referenced in the title of the consensus and the content of the consensus itself. Again, if we go back to Williamson's presentation of the Washington Consensus, we see that it really wasn't about Washington at all. It was a juxtaposition of ideas from a variety of OECD countries, especially in Europe, with ideas being generated by Latin American development economists and policymakers. It really had very little to do with the IMF, the World Bank, the Treasury Department of the US government. So by attaching a geographic location to a certain paradigm, it serves probably to drive home some other point rather than the specific location of the country itself. Okay, so what does this tell us about the Minsk Consensus? Well, here I would suggest my fourth thesis, which would be that we have to recognize that we're living in a time of changing paradigms, when implicitly the end goal of development and transition, that all countries should become consolidated democracies, capitalist countries looking like the United States or the United Kingdom or the OECD countries, this is changing. Many of us would still like to see this, but those of us who might favor such an approach have to recognize that such an end goal portrait of development and transition has lost at least some of its luster. It's enough only to look at the United States during Donald Trump, the European Union now, which especially in the last 3 or 4 years has been described as undergoing a Euro crisis, a migration crisis, Brexit, Catalonia, facing the specter of populist nationalism. If this is the блестящее будущее, this is the glittering future that we are recommending countries transition or converge towards, we may need to think about this a little bit more. And what this suggests is that maybe the demanders of answers about policy reform questions, countries like Belarus, can increasingly not be only demanders but also suppliers of answers to questions about development and transition. My fifth thesis is that oftentimes these consensuses are set up implicitly positioning the state and the market as in contradiction with another. The Washington Consensus is oftentimes presented as about shrinking the state and strengthening the market, and the Beijing Consensus arguably the other way around. But in fact, if we're honest, we should recognize that development is really about strengthening the state and strengthening the market together. We see this in the most successful developed countries in the world, and in fact, economics and political science teaches us that markets and states need each other both to function well if they are individually going to function well. Well-functioning markets require strong state institutions to protect property rights, correct failures, provide macroeconomic stability, and well-functioning states require markets that can allocate resources so that the state does not need to be the operations manager of the national economy. This is also, I would argue, a contemporary feature of policy reform in capitalism. My sixth thesis would be that if we want to understand policy outcomes that we regard as unsatisfactory, we should not be looking at theory, we should not be looking at ideology. We should instead be looking at political economy drivers. For example, if we want to explain the global financial crisis of 2008 that originated in financial markets in the United States and to some extent Western Europe, it's oftentimes popular to find the explanation for this in neoliberalism, some sort of global market Bolshevist ideological conspiracy. But in fact, when you really understand what happened in these countries, the key driver was the use of political lobbies that prevented financial regulators in these countries from effectively addressing emerging threats to financial sustainability. Likewise, when we look at inequalities and the much declaimed hollowing out of the middle class, we saw yesterday Branko Milanovic's elephant theory. We just heard reference to Stiglitz. This is not about globalization. Globalization can create wealth and can reduce inequalities. Instead, what we see in country after country is that interest groups capture the gains from globalization and prevent those gains from being redistributed from winners to losers. Again, a political economy story. In transition economies, if we are unhappy with the results of transition, be it from shock therapy too fast or gradualism too slow, oftentimes what we find at the end of the day is Joel Hellman's story about the winners of reform preventing subsequent governance reforms from working to create the kinds of market and state mechanisms necessary for a satisfactory outcome. Again, a political economy story. Sometimes reforms need to be protected from the winners of reform as well as from the losers. My seventh thesis, and this takes us back to Belarus, is that Belarus is very much a bellwether country. The Minsk Consensus may be interesting not because it's like the Washington Consensus or the Beijing Consensus. It's about Washington and the US and Beijing and China, but because Belarus is increasingly, I would argue, a very representative middle-income country facing the challenges faced by all countries in the world. Belarus is a transition economy that has managed to avoid some of the worst disappointments associated with market reform, while also retaining and modernizing state capacity inherited from the Soviet era. Lots of your neighbors are in the same situation. Belarus is also looking to strengthen its market mechanisms while improving and modernizing its state institutions without creating the pernicious interest group dynamics that can sabotage both market reforms and governance modernization projects. It's also doing this without, while trying to avoid the depletion of its human and natural capital upon which its future and sustainable development depends. These are challenges facing all countries in the world. In this respect, Belarus is extremely representative. My eighth thesis is that part of the bellwether or representative aspect of Belarus and why the Minsk Consensus is interesting in this respect is because you can also see very important vulnerabilities in Belarus. You can see that for all its accomplishments as an upper middle income country, Belarus faces macroeconomic vulnerabilities, and it also faces important political tensions linked to the East-West dynamics that are now taking hold. And again, lots of other countries are in that situation. And here, when we look at Belarusian diplomacy, of trying to promote the integration of integrations, to find an accommodation for development of a country that in some sense is touched by and between, but not fully of Eurasian and European integration. This also is a set of circumstances relevant for many other countries that are caught between various regional integration dynamics and would like to see not only regional, but generally global and multilateral answers to their development challenges. And my ninth and final thesis is that really the answer that Belarus needs, the solutions to these challenges, are the same solutions that other countries are trying to find, and they are the solutions of sustainable development. They are solutions of multilateralism. They are solutions that find win-win answers to social, economic, and environmental questions. These are what the Global Agenda 2030 for Sustainable Development that Slava Shiligika just described, and the Minsk Consensus can be about a way to take this agenda forward in middle-income countries in Europe, and that is something that I think many countries would be interested in Belarus's answer to. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ben. Very comprehensive presentation of what the Minsk Consensus could be. I particularly appreciated the political economic drivers. I think it's really the key, as well as pointing out that Belarus is not in a unique situation, which I think even being in Minsk, we cannot enough to emphasize. And there are lessons learned, obviously, from the region as well as from the globe, which could be applied to help the modernization effort, both in the private sector and the state sector. And I think very important that these shouldn't be either or. These actually come together, at least in the successful examples. And now let's go to Bas. How you can compare regional trends and how Belarus fits into this? Thank you.
Can I have the presentation? Good morning. I will talk about what I will call the IMF consensus. And the IMF consensus is that you need to get both your macro policies and your micro right. If your macro is wrong, you end up poor. If your micro is wrong, you won't continue growing forever. And let me discuss this a bit in the Belarus context. So, between 1995 and 2007, Belarus had one of the fastest growing economies in Eastern Europe. This chart shows you the increase in GDP per capita between 1995 and 2007. Belarus is on the right, the red bar. Since 2010, growth has slowed significantly, and now Belarus is one of the poorest performers. It's now on the far left. So what was behind this change? Well, one reason was that the macro situation during the boom was not sustainable. As you can see on the chart on the left, you had a tremendous investment boom, but saving did not increase, and the result was a large current account deficit, as you see on the right, which led to several balance of payments crises and a crashing currency. But this was not the only problem. During the boom, micro incentives were not quite right. You had high growth rates, but productivity was stagnating. And why was this? Let's take a step back. Let's look at microeconomic theory. Let's take a standard production function, and I'll try to make it simple for the non-economist among us. Say a factory has both capital and labor. And let's assume a company that delivers packages. Initially, it delivers packages on food. It's not very productive. Then the company buys bikes. Great productivity increase. A few years later, it buys cars. Even more productivity increase. But then thereafter, it can buy fancier cars, but the productivity increase gets less and less. Eventually, the productivity increase stops. What you need now is to do other smart things. You buy software to plan routes. Those kinds of things. You change your production technology. So just expanding your inputs runs into diminishing returns. This chart shows you capital per worker and output per worker. And what I would like you to remember is the shape of this chart. It flattens off. So what you want is productivity increases. For the same amount of inputs, you can produce more and more. And if you have that, what you get over time, you go on the straight line. As your capital per worker increases, your output per worker increases, but in a straight line. You don't see diminishing returns. So this is theory, but we can actually see this in practice. And let's compare Belarus and Poland. In Poland, this underlying productivity growth has been the key driver of economic growth. And in Poland, output per worker has increased in line with capital per worker. In Belarus, high investment has been the key driver. And productivity growth has slowed and is now even negative. And so you had increases in capital per worker, but it led to lower and lower increases in output. And let's see this chart. So this is Poland since the early 90s. And you see a nice straight line. Capital per worker, real GDP per worker has increased in line with real capital per worker. This is how economists would like to see it happening in the long run. And this is what we have seen in Belarus. Capital per worker increased. Initially, you get strong growth, but you get diminishing return, and eventually it gets flat. It was not just the amount of investment that led to declining returns. It was also capital use was inefficient. And in many instances, it kept viable state-owned enterprises alive rather than productively supporting new companies. And so lack of proper incentive, including in state-owned enterprises, that led to an inefficient use of resources. And in fact, Belarus is running a bit into the same constraints as Poland in the late 80s. This is a chart showing real capital per worker in Poland between 1970 and 1989, and real GDP per worker. And you see, between the late 70s and 89, capital per worker increased by almost 50%, but output per worker did not increase. This was the problem. And so to get a more efficient use of resources, you need to restructure state-owned enterprises. This chart shows you the large share of loss-making companies in Belarus. And to create a level playing field for the creation of dynamic new private sector companies. That does not mean that there need to be a wholesale overhaul of Belarus' social model. Some of the richest countries in Europe, they have large governments and they have low income inequality. But what they have, as I will show in the next few charts, they have competitive markets with oversight that ensures sufficient competition. And they have efficient governance. This chart shows GDP per capita in Europe as a percent of the euro area. And dark green are the richest countries. And you see that Northwestern Europe is the richest region in Europe. And this chart shows two things. On the x-axis shows how competitive economies are. The further to the right, the more competition there is. On the y-axis, it shows income inequality. The further up, the more income inequality. And the countries that I have circled on the lower right, they combine low income inequality and competitive markets. And these are precisely the rich countries in Northwestern Europe. They also have effective governments. This chart shows you government effectiveness. This is an indicator compiled by the World Bank. And GDP per capita. And you see, the more effective the governments are, the richer the countries. And again, you see Northwestern Europe is in the top right. And these governments are not necessarily small. In fact, the link between the size of governments and how rich countries are is not very strong. And Netherlands and Germany, which are both very rich, have the same size of governments approximately as Belarus. So to summarize, macro stability in Belarus has been restored. So one of the two elements of the IMF consensus, you need good macro policies, that's back in place again. But we need to get to the second part to also get the micro right. Otherwise, it will be challenging to get back to fast growth. To conclude, it will be difficult for Belarus to go back to sustained rapid growth. Even if you have your macro right, getting back to high public investment or high SOE investment alone will not do the trick. This runs into diminishing returns. You also need to get the micro right and get to a more efficient use of resources and a dynamic private sector. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Bas. It was an excellent technocratic approach after a theoretical one, and certainly felt like a reality check in a lot of ways. Thanks for the excellent regional comparisons as well. I think it was, even for me, it was very interesting to see where actually Belarus is on a map, and this kind of map. Now, let's move to Karlis Smits from the World Bank, who actually going to do, I think, also a comparison. He has also a presentation, and yeah, it's also a different angle of the same question. Please.
Thank you. Good afternoon and good morning. I'll spend a few minutes talking about two things, about happiness and what are the reflections on Belarus in terms of the reform process. So let's talk about happiness. What is a happiness? In order to understand it, we look at the economic development literature and economic literature, but there's this one quote you might all know. It's coming very close from here. It's from Lev Tolstoy, who says that all happy families are alike. Each unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. And it's an important phrase because it can be also reflected not only to sort of psychological state of the families, but also to economic development. And I'll use this analogy throughout the presentation. So let's think about what are the happy families and what are characteristics of these happy families. And I think these are the 10 characteristics of the happy family, and this happens to be so-called Washington Consensus. It's difficult to find a rich, happy country which does not satisfy these 10 points. And if you Google Washington Consensus, these are the 10 points, what you find on Wikipedia. Fiscal discipline, public finance, which supports provision of public goods. It's tax reform, interest rates, which allocate capital in an efficient manner, competitive exchange rate, trade liberalization, a growing private sector and reduced state presence, deregulation, legal security, the property rights. I think we all agree that these are characteristics. And also, if you look at what Belarus is doing over the last 2 decades, and including its action plan of 2060-22, it largely signals of its intent to follow these characteristics. So I think in terms of the consensus, I think there is a broad agreement on in terms of the direction of change. And I think we all recognize that over the last 20 years, during the transition, steps have been made to foster fiscal discipline. We know that it's work in progress. There are quasi-fiscal activities, et cetera, et cetera. As IMF colleagues also mentioned, in terms of the exchange rate, there has been made progress. In terms of trade liberalization, we see process in accession to WTO, et cetera, et cetera. I think I outlined in one in sort of cross-cutting in red. It's a 0.8. I think there is some disagreement in terms about SOE and the role of the government and in terms of the privatization, but I think that's the only thing which we can agree differs. If we agree that this is these are the characteristics of the happy family rich countries, I think also in Belarus there's a broad recognition towards what needs to be done towards that change in order to achieve these characteristics. And I think there's no political agreement in terms of the scope, scale, and timeline of such reform, of such change. And I think that's a thing that we all discuss. And I think that is a difference between countries. And I'll give you 2 examples. One is based from my previous work. I was based in Beijing. How different countries, typical countries do, and these might be 2 extremes. So first example is so-called Beijing bicycle, how they do reforms and decision process. In Beijing, everybody used to have bicycles, and always when they refer to reforms, they say riding a bicycle, there are 2 ways to fail. Either you go too slow, you fall, you lose gravity, or you go too fast. And the Chinese colleagues always say this is how they view reforms. And if you continue to use that analogy, any transition process is movement from one thing to another, and these are the 2 wheels of that bicycle. The largest wheel is so-called old economy, sort of a pre-transition, and this is a key driver of growth in China, and also in here we see that the old economy is a driver. It has been continuously, and abrupt change would not be possible. Some countries have done it, but in a large country like China, that was not an option. The front wheel is so-called new economy, which is sort of a disruptive, and a new economy is a smaller one. It goes in opposite direction than the old one. So in a sense, they go in there's a traction, and as one new economy is sort of a little bit of the headwind. And each of the innovation of the new economy is introduced very gradually, and often challenges economy is facing is used as an opportunity to unleash these changes and reforms. And that continuously is channeled to the old economy. So this is a gradual process, how it is being phased out. So this is a Beijing sort of a bicycle. Again, There's no Beijing consensus in terms of the economic policy. If you look at the 18th Congress, Communist Party's third plenum 3 years ago, or just recently 19th Congress, you see all of the elements of Washington Consensus, competitive exchange rates, trade liberalization are there. Also, the role of the SOE reform is on a plate. The only difference is the way how these are introduced. So this is a Beijing gradual approach. Most countries use this so-called tricycle, and I call it the CRIX size. It consists of 3 wheels. Usually reform is triggered by some kind of a crisis, which trigger a response, which is actually doing something. And once the crisis is over, it creates inertia. What we have seen over the last 2 decades, particularly in the past decade in Belarus, it has a very strong capacity to respond very prudently to economic challenges it has faced. As it was mentioned, over the last crisis which happened, macroeconomic policies were put in order quite quickly, and I think that is a recognition of sort of ability of the public sector, sort of capacity in terms of the central bank and government to address these challenges. But once these challenges are addressed, inertia starts to feed in. Some of the structural reforms are not, structural problems are not addressed, and they gradually feed to the next phase of the crisis. Therefore, this is a bicycle of three wheels. Once you are inertia, there's no traction with the ground. So which characteristics, what happened in Belarus? As Bas already mentioned, one of the key issues in Belarus is savings investment gap. And economic laws of gravity you cannot defy them. Sooner or later, this adjustment will happen. And this graph illustrates that the savings investment balance adjustment did happen. And it happened over the last 3 years, and we have over the last 5 years, it was about the 10 percentage points of GDP. Structural reforms, the purpose of structural reforms is also proactively to make that adjustment in a more orderly manner, because most of the crises happen when this adjustment happens disorderly. And one characteristic which is very unusual for Belarus is that most of that adjustment happened in so-called private sector savings investment balance. There was a little adjustment in the government's savings investment balance. As Bas already indicated, that is indication that the footprint of the government might be too large, and there is some scope to address particularly state-owned enterprises reform. How to do these reforms in an orderly manner? I think World Development Report, which looked at these issues, looking at the global experience, they see that there are 3 characteristics that are very common to successful reform transition, and these are commitment, coordination, and cooperation. So these are the 3 ingredients of successful transition. The commitment is a commitment to direction and reform. It's not a commitment to the speed. No matter what speed you do, you have to commit to direction and reform. The second is very important, is a coordination of that reform among all levels of government, including with the private sector. And I think one of the key challenges in Belarus was and is a coordination with all levels of government, and also with private sector actors. And finally, it's a cooperation of all stakeholders, including general public. It's extremely difficult to do reforms which they are not supported by population. So how we see Belarus, we have a vision of Belarus towards a competitive, inclusive, and dynamic Belarus. And obviously, Belarus has been very successful over the last decades in terms of GDP per capita. Poverty rates are declining, and Human Development Index is very high. So there is a good foundation. What we have seen, the key challenge today is that is avoiding a low growth trajectory and preserving that income growth which Belarus achieved over the last decades. We see 2 challenges. One is that external circumstances have radically changed, and secondly, that some of the deep-seated structural reforms have not been addressed. The 3 key pressures are still there in terms of the misallocation of capital and labor, which Bas already alluded. The social contract is also unsustainable because it was built on a full employment and a stable wage growth, including public employment in state-owned enterprises. And thirdly, there's still excessive dependence on external sources of finance, which creates makes economy vulnerable. I'll skip this slide. As already you saw in Bas's slide, we also project the medium-term growth of around 2% per year. This graph is actually, this one is the first time it's showed in publicly. This shows income distribution based on a household budget surveys in Belarus. And the red line is a so-called poverty threshold, which is $10 per day. As you see, the Belarus income distribution is very uniform, but as you see, gradually from 2014, 2015, and 2016, that peak hump is moving closer to that poverty line. So that is one of the challenges going forward, is that growth of 2% might not be sufficient to preserve that distribution gains that Belarus has achieved. How to preserve that? Already we see three elements of sort of that transformation that needs to be completed. One is to make economy more competitive, and I think I'll not repeat, that is well understood. I think the second transition is so-called social transition. There has to be, you have to come with a new social contract mechanism, which includes strengthening traditional safety nets, including unemployment insurance, and also social protection in terms of the tariff alignment in energy and household utilities. I think that's an element that is extremely important. And the third element is to upgrading institutional framework to make business environment more dynamic and market-oriented. So we see these three elements of transition which need to go in parallel. The transition is costly in terms of new budget allocations for social safety nets. Also, state-owned enterprise transformation is costly in terms of social costs and also in fiscal costs. But we want to point out is that no reform or status quo might actually be more costly. These two graphs show a relationship between GDP growth and public debt. We see that as growth is decelerating, public debt levels are increasing. And the second graph shows that income convergence relative to Russia has stopped over the last few years and actually plateaued. And I think it is an important convergence mechanism. If you look at the Poland and Baltic states, the convergence to income levels in Europe was an important motivator to change. I think this is also an important to look for Belarus. And finally, concluding remark, there's a lot of talk about reforms, more reforms or less reforms. I think that's not a bottom line. The bottom line is economic growth or happiness springs from better reforms, not just more reforms. And I think that's an important concluding remark. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Karlis. It was certainly creative to put the consensus into happiness. At the same time, I think there's going to be a few reflections on the presentation overall later on. But let's move to Pavel Daneyko, who has now a very difficult job to reflect from a Belarusian economist's viewpoint. And I would also like to, if you don't mind, particularly reflect on the SOE and the state-owned enterprises issue, because I think it's really the bottom line, really the key issue which is coming out from all the presentations. Thank you.
I will only talk about private sector. Journalists asked me those questions. So when actually Belarus is going to start the reform? And I try to understand why they thought that there was no reform ongoing. So if you look at Washington Consensus, it's mostly about privatization, macroeconomic stabilization, and lowering the barriers for business. Belarusian business was built without all these conditions present. But if you look at the private sector development, no privatization played a positive role. if there's a limited number of people in the society capable of being entrepreneurs, it means that the most active part of them just created new companies. I believe that would be a huge mistake to think that socialist companies work badly because they're managed in a bad fashion. This Janusz Korne methodology, and he says that socialist companies were designed to work in a bad fashion. Therefore, the privatization for their own guys, like in Russia and Ukraine, paralyzes business activity because the restructuring of those companies is impossible.
Yeah, in Belarus, they decided to rather go the greenfield way. So how were these new companies set up? It was against the backdrop of the high inflation rate, of costly financial resources. In 2013, I guess, we had the information that $3 million worth of turnover meant that you could have allocate a separate room on your premises for inspections and audits, because the government was auditing the companies all the time. So what were the businesses that were able to survive that? The export-oriented producing companies. This was done with the unfocused strategies. This is since then the Russian and Ukrainian markets have seen new shops sprouting with Belarusian cosmetics, Belarusian doors, Belarusian food products, and etc. These companies were quite simple in their strategy. They were aiming at European quality at a Chinese price. No marketing was needed at all. The flow of goods would go to Russia and Ukraine, and the markets there were growing thanks to oil prices. So what happened then? Probably in 2005, 2006, an important shift was observed in the mindset of the general public towards the private sector. In the 90s, in Belarus, the attitude towards the private sector was somewhat negative for the Belarusians. I mean, we all were the descendants of the Soviet heritage, and buying and selling things was sort of frowned upon. Then by year 2000, it turned out that there were companies that quite efficient, that were set up by the efforts of successful entrepreneurs, and that changed the attitudes of people towards the private sector. And if we look at the attitude of people in Ukraine and Russia and Belarus towards the private business, you would see differences. Here we don't have oligarchs, we have no wealth that was generated by rent or corruption. Maybe I am wrong, but I believe that this served a good platform for beginning reforms in the private sector. And we all know the result. We are ranked 38th in doing business review in terms of the business environment. What else is different in Belarus in terms of the business environment as compared to our neighbors? We had a chance to compare the values of the Belarusian businesses, of Russian businesses, and Ukrainian businesses. For Belarusian businesses, among the priorities they have the quality of the produce. For our Ukrainian and Russian colleagues, this is probably somewhere around the 10th or 11th place of their priorities. Another priority for the Belarusian companies is the openness to all markets. Our entrepreneurs don't see domestic market as the only market to work with. These new values, these new concepts are becoming more and more widespread across the business community. I also wanted to say a few words about the Washington Consensus. Quite often, we get too carried away with setting up the organizations of market economy, not the market economy institutes. Market economy institutes are basically the institutes of the systems of values that basically administered by the organizations that either reprimand or encourage companies for non-adherence or adherence to certain values. If we set up the organizations that are not in line with the values of the environment, we're left with quasi-organizations. They look like they are market-based, but they are not. There's a good saying by Ian Smith. He was the last white president in Rhodesia. So after Mugabe came into power, he said that African democracy is a simple thing. One person, one vote, once in their lifetime. So without the paradigm shift in terms of values, any attempts at reforms that are not based on the value change will be deadlocked. That's all from me.
Thank you, Pavel. Thank you, Pavel. As usual, you said a lot, but what you didn't say is also very talkative, meaning we can think about that as well. Now the panel is complete, and what I would like to suggest is turning into the audience for questions. I have a few questions dimensions which I would like to raise to the panel myself, but let's see what the audience think and what kind of questions we can gather from you. Please raise your hands and identify yourself if there's any questions. It seems there is not. Okay, so let me then go back to the panel with three points or three questions or three dimensions. I already quoted Stiglitz, but I'm going to quote him again. Like, we talk about transition a lot when it comes to these countries, simply because of the mandate of the international organizations. But I think at the same time, we kind of have to put transition into a different perspective, and we can say, or at least Stiglitz is saying, that all advanced economies are transitioning, are in the transition phase, from manufacturing to service sector and knowledge-based economy, and this is a major transition, right? There is also other several transitions which is going on, which have global as well as local circumstances or impact. A, there is a demographic transition to an aging economy, and B, the knowledge economy is different, or the difference of the knowledge economy from the traditional economy. You know, the challenge from this, the knowledge economy is creating a learning society, as well as increasing in knowledge base of enormous increase in standards of living over the past centuries. So these are the challenges which are global, or at least for the West are. Now the second question or dimension, which I would like to ask the panel to reflect on, is the elephant, at least here in the elephant in the Washington consensus locally, and we haven't heard, is Russia, right? It's the relationship between, how to say, Belarus, or the Belarus economic strategy, which, you know, like 15, 20 years ago was based on the Russian economy, and how much has changed, and how much this is actually impacting what's going on in a lot of, in the economy development. And number three is the role of the state, which all the internationals essentially pondered a little bit. Karlis was mentioning the adjustment. And what do you think, what kind of adjustment is going on? Pavel was mentioning this. No privatization, no oligarchs. You know, I myself seeing that, you know, since given the state was saved, or the state kind of, Belarus still has a state, which has kind of become the value on itself, vis-a-vis, particularly when it comes to Ukraine or Moldova, right? Keeping it in Eastern Europe. In reforms in Ukraine, it's about rebuilding the state and the social contract. In Belarus, it's about reforming the state because there is something to reform. So how much the role of the state adjusting, or has been adjusting already in Belarus, I particularly mean how much the control function of the state is changing into a regulatory one? Let's start with Ben. Obviously, you are more than welcome to reflect on each other as well, just to make the debate floating. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Balázs. Picking up the three questions you've just raised, excellent. One of the challenges that the advanced capitalist economies and developing economies are facing is the changing nature of development. You know, in the 20th century, development and modernization meant industrial development, and then post-industrial with the creation of service sectors. And these patterns of development had many desirable features. One was that they, on balance, tended to reduce inequality as workers became more and more productive as they moved from agriculture into manufacturing. They became better educated with universal education. Economies and countries became more equal. It was possible to have a broader social contract. The whole thing seemed to work. This was an attractive model. And that's now changing, I think, both in the most advanced, so to speak, developed economies and in developing ones. We see this, for example, in the phenomenon of premature deindustrialization, that more and more developing economies are reaching a certain level of GDP per capita with smaller shares of GDP generated from industry, and especially manufacturing, which means that these social aspects such as increased equality that was previously associated with industrial modernization isn't necessarily there. This is due to the primarily the technological change, the knowledge economy, if you like, but this brings with it not only strains in terms of reductions in the drivers of modernization that reduce inequalities, it also creates latent instabilities within a political economy and in terms of financial systems. So if we take the United States economy, for example, today, so much of the dynamism is in the IT sector. But there are real latent socio-political and economic instabilities in that. You have these huge companies like Google and Facebook, huge by stock market capitalization with very, very small employment, with employment concentrated in a few places in Silicon Valley or in Seattle or wherever. The wealth just doesn't trickle down from these sorts of new knowledge economy type of industries. Not only that, you have situations in which the business model of these companies to a significant extent is based upon situations in which the marginal cost of selling another product is zero, right? It costs almost nothing to attract another user to Facebook. And yet the marginal revenue of doing so is positive and oftentimes growing, because networks are worth more to everyone in the network when more people join. So you don't have the basic stabilizing situation of markets where marginal revenue is falling, marginal cost is rising, they reach at an equilibrium that stabilizes the system. That's also increasingly not present in these dynamic drivers of progress in the most advanced, if you like, capitalist economies. And we are only now beginning to come to terms with both the financial, business, and social impact of this. The elephant in the room for the Washington Consensus, Russia. I actually see Russia as a much bigger elephant in the room, not in the context of economic policy and ideas about how to organize your economy for development and growth. I think in a lot of ways what Russia has done is no more inconsistent with the classical Washington Consensus than what the United States has done or what China has done. Well, Russia has really changed things, in my personal opinion, is by rewriting the rules of European security with the developments in Ukraine in 2013 and 2014. Of course, the Russian Federation has all sorts of justifications for doing that. It's not my place to either criticize or justify that. Everyone has their justifications for their policies, but that is what has really changed the understanding in Europe about how the game is played. And I think that's a bigger game changer. And I think finally, in terms of the role of the state and adjusting the role of the state, I think all states are in the process of adjustment in various ways. Depending upon the nature of the challenge, states have to both develop and maintain a social contract, regulate potentially destabilizing situations in the economy, and guarantee national security of the citizens in the international sphere. And that's always a demanding set of challenges, and it's not getting easier. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bas. Yeah.
A few observations. First, the idea that living standards have stagnated in the last few decades is a myth. It's not true. Let's give an example. 20 years ago, let's say, if you wanted to have a very good video camera, $5,000. You wanted to have a good camera, $1,000. You wanted to have a mobile phone, $1,000. You wanted to have a compass, $100. Now, if you want to have all of this together and much better quality, you have this. It's called an iPhone. Everyone can afford that. So there is a lot of technological progress that has raised living standards. These days they are so cheap that people take it for granted. But this has led to a dramatic increase in living standards. You can now look up everything online. If I want directions, I have it on Google on my iPhone. The idea that we are not better off than 2 decades ago, I think that is simply not true. Yes, we have problems with income inequality, but that does not mean that incomes of most people have stagnated. And yes, there may be a problem with IT companies, and there is inequality of wealth distribution. But many of these companies have also brought many good things. And companies that have a large market share now may not be around tomorrow. Could anyone imagine 10 years ago that iPhone would be invented? Nokia was very important. Thereafter, we had, what was the one called with the keyboard? BlackBerry. Everyone complained that BlackBerry had such a large market share. With enough competition, these disappear. I worry about income inequality. The solution is more competition. And in some countries, like in Western Europe, and also in some countries in Eastern Europe, you have competition. In the US, sometimes not enough. Let me give you one example. I live in Poland. I have on my iPad a data plan, 30 gigabyte, $7 a month. In the US, you can buy a 3 gigabyte data plan for $30. So many people think that in the US there is too much competition. There is not. If there is too little competition, you get income inequality. And this is something that countries in Northwestern Europe have grasped very well, and the US should grasp better. So if you're worried about income inequality, encourage competition. That abolishes rent. Don't be afraid of competition. Finally, a remark on Russia. Russia, of course, has been very important for Belarus, both as export market and also as a source of revenues and budget support. And in the past, that peaked at around 10% of GDP. It's now much, much less. It's not likely to come back. That's a further reason why you need to adjust your economy. if you don't get presents from abroad, you need to earn it domestically.
Let me talk briefly about the 3 points that were raised. One is about what is the change in a global economy. And I think the biggest challenge is not about questioning market economy or other model. It's an adjustment. What is happening, one of the greatest transformations which we are witnessing today is the rise of China. Over the last 3 decades, it is gradually unleashing market forces, unleashing competitiveness, and that has a global impact of biblical proportions, that has a material impact of what we see in the United States and Western Europe. The global economic trade system and globalization was built on primarily on a merchandise goods trade, WTO, etc. And we have seen globalization and liberalization in this iPhone is made in China. It is easily shipped anywhere in the world. As economies is becoming richer and richer, it's more service-based. Manufacturing has moved out from the United States to China, and it has become more services. As services become more available, you want also trade in services. And one of the biggest tension points in relationship between China is that access to Chinese market, similar to what in Japan happened, to the service industry is still closed. I mean, we witnessed what happened when Trump administration started to work. Finally, after many decades, credit card companies could start operating in China. And this is just one example. And I think there will be a lot of these tensions going forward, how global economy is adjusting. We see efforts in this Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was a sort of one of the first global agreements to understand how service-based transactions can be done, is currently on hold. So I think there is an adjustment going on. Also, international financial and Bretton Woods institutions are also gradually adjusting to increasing role of China as a hypothetically largest shareholder soon. So there would be changes, and we will have to adjust to these changes. But nevertheless, this is not a questioning of the free market or role of the competition. Secondly, relationship with Russia. Obviously, Belarus has benefited through the 3 channels favorably from Russia. It's through the trade channel, through the capital inflows. It's both official and private sector, and also because of the oil transfer and preferential sort of the treatment of the gas prices. I mean, although these were beneficial, there was also pitfalls. So as you know, economy is not diversified in its export portfolio. And also some of these decisions are subject to political changes. So we have seen what happened where there is a disagreement on some of the oil deliveries. It also jolts, and market reaction is quite swift. So obviously it is important to have a good relationship with Russia. It's more than $1 trillion economy, and there's no way Belarus can avoid that relationship. It is better to build that relationship on a rules-based trading system. Therefore, again, participation of Belarus in WTO is a welcome step, and they can continue to benefit. Finally, on the role of the state, what we are advocating is an adjustment of the role of the state. We see here, as in many other countries, state plays 3 predominant roles. One is a promoter of growth in terms of actively participating in driving growth, particularly through state-owned enterprises. We see nothing wrong with that kind of a role. I mean, that's a political choice. Well, we see that that kind of a role has a tension with 2 other roles of the government. One is a regulator and an enforcer of rules, and creating a playing field also with the private sector. And thirdly is be a very responsible owner of state assets. What we are saying is that the role of the state needs to be adjusted. It has to be a regulator and a better owner of assets. We're not saying that all state-owned enterprises have to be privatized. What we're saying is that they need to be managed better. As an example, we know that currently a lot of SOEs are reporting directly to different line ministries, which creates a conflict of interest in terms of the regulatory function and ownership function and coordination. So one way would be to have a unified agency which would manage these assets, as an example. And then finally, as the state moves from the direct economic growth participant, also it would have to ensure that provision of social services are done through the formal social safety net channels. If somebody cannot find a job, it's not a responsibility of the state to find employment for that person, but it's a responsibility of the state to provide the social unemployment benefits, so it provides sufficient time for that person, him or her, to find a place. Also, as tariff adjustment is happening, it's important to have a very well-targeted social assistance program, so those families who are not able to afford tariffs, utility tariffs that are at the cost recovery level, are supported. So in summary, we see not a change of the government as a solution, obviously not. It's just an adjusting role of the state and including adjusting institutions. And we need to recognize that government is already working. As you know, already last year, the targeted social support system for vulnerable households was introduced to support energy tariffs. Also, work of unemployment insurance formal is also progressing. So these are important steps to in continuation of reform process. Thank you.
The changes that are taking place in the world are primarily related to a serious drop in the transaction costs. And this will have 5 major global repercussions. Everything's going to be cheap, which is good news, of course. The customization of production is next, a sharp rise in security, localization of social and economic life, and the bad news, further inequality, income inequality. Why everything is going to be cheap? It's the Uberization, so to speak. We can eliminate several components, several links in the chain which were costly, and this, of course, brings down the price. If Uber uses blockchains, then the prices will go down. They won't need any personnel. Crowd economy. This also helps bring down the cost of experimentation whenever you create new products. So you are on the market right away, and you can sell your product which is ready, market ready. And this, of course, brings down the capital expenditures. Customization next. Aladdin made boots and he was selling those at the market. This is not true. No one was selling any boots in the market in medieval times because there were no sizes like 48, 42. Our feet are different. Nobody has equally long feet. They used lasts back then for each separate foot. Now, what can you improve with the help of customization? Internet helps you know everything about everybody. Plus additive production and direct contact between the manufacturer and the buyer. This helps create 100% customized things. We see how it affects fashion, for example. This of course brings the price up by 20-30%, but then you eliminate all the go-betweens. This will make the price 2 or 3 times cheaper. Now, security, Internet of Things, and AI in medicine, artificial intelligence in medicine. This, of course, helps the world become more secure. additive production and localization of energy. It's another trend. Localization of production, then for the function of centralized countries, like they came around just 200-300 years ago. And the social life will be more localized, just as economic life. And of course, there are lots of books about income inequality. I don't think I should dwell any further on that. So those are the main 5 trends that I wanted to single out, something that's going to change life. Now, the relations with Russia. I was in Rotterdam, in Holland, and listening to my Russian colleagues speaking. They had a slide they showed that in 2006, Russian GDP was 70% produced by private sector. Back then, we only Belarusian private sector made only 25%. Last year, Russian GDP, it's 70% SOE. But in Belarus, the 45% of private sector and 55%, but we believe it's 55 private sector percent. I think our economies in 2 countries are moving in totally different ways, and I hope this will go on like this. State regulation. It was quite complex for Belarus. Before the Ukrainian Maidan, I had a talk in the Ukrainian School of Economy, and I was giving a talk on the hidden champions. Those are high-tech Belarusian companies that dominate world markets.
And this was all moderated by Pavel Sharamet, who is the rector at that school, and one lady stood up and said, "I don't understand a word of what's being said." And she worked at the auditing company, not among the big 4, but auditing Belarusian companies, she said. Terrible companies. I'm being put in awful hotels. I'm being taken to awful restaurants. And he said, I worked with Pavel here for 3 days. Great companies, great hotels, great restaurants. So I approached this lady and then I asked her what was the hotel that she was put in. And it turns out that there are 2 separate worlds that exist in Belarus. And these are the 2 worlds that live in different hotels, they go to different restaurants, and they don't overlap almost entirely. And there's the state-owned world, and there's a private world. And fortunately, in the first world, the role of the state is huge, and the second, it's thankfully diminishing. So we see that the private sector is getting good news every year. Then we see that there's less pressure applied to business. But as for the state-owned sector, well, we don't know anything about that because we don't deal with them.
Thank you, Pavel.
Спасибо, Павел.
With this round, there's also still some time to ask
У нас есть еще немного времени на вопросы из аудитории, если таковые есть. Я вижу 2 вопроса, поэтому, пожалуйста, микрофон возьмите и представьтесь. Господин первый и дама за ним. I'm Nikolai Trifonov from the Russian Society, Belarusian Society of Valuers. I wanted to get back to the intervention by Pavel Daneyko. I mean, during his intervention, during the panel. In conclusion, he said that, generally speaking, we need to be creating institutes, sets of values, rather than organizations, to implement reforms. And probably one of the biggest such institutes that we need is the civil society at large. At the same time, it's quite clear that this is a challenging thing that doesn't happen overnight. So, shouldn't we expect any reforms at all unless we as a society are civil enough and prepared? So I would like our panelists, and of course Pavel Daneyko as well, to comment on that.
Спасибо, and there was a lady also with a question, if we can get the mic there.
I'm Marina Zhuk. A question to Pavel Daneyko, who's a general director of IPM Institute. We all understand that for the business to be efficient and for the economy to develop, there should be reasonable playing field and understandable legal framework. Our country has been adopting a number of legal instruments to stimulate entrepreneurship. So, in your opinion, the things that were recently adopted, are they sufficient, or there's still something missing, something crucial in terms of legal framework for the business to develop efficiently?
Thank you. So we have two questions.
Спасибо. Итак, у нас два вопроса.
First about the civil society.
Первый касательно развития гражданского общества, и второй касательно правил игры в Беларуси. Давайте начнем с Павла, а затем дадим слово другим участникам панели. If we look at the entire post-socialist area, you wouldn't see any meaningful proper reforms anywhere at all. The countries that entered the EU, they just got the reform agenda from the EU. So there was no political struggle around this agenda. They just took the order and made it happen. In countries that had to develop their own agendas, they failed to develop those. Should we consider Russian or Ukrainian reforms as a success story? Well, this is a rhetorical question. I mean, you cannot force yourself onto anyone. If the society is not ready to accept the reforms that are being offered, though the reforms will fail or they will transform into a quasi-instrument like the oligarchs in Ukraine or Russia. So the dreams about private business becoming the locomotive for development were undermined by the implementation practice. So the function of the oligarchs actually were quite opposite. They started putting spokes in the wheels of the reforms. So, once again, the ways and methods of transforming society is not that easy and simple. So the Belarusian business grew in spite all of the recommendations and preconditions rather than thanks to them. And therefore, there's still more research that needs to be done about the fundamental rules for changing the society. The biggest thing now for private business development in Belarus is to secure good quality of higher education offered here and growth of investment into scientific development and scientific research. We work quite closely with our champion companies, and the biggest challenge for them is to secure qualified workforce. They have to resort to hiring engineers from the Czech Republic, from Germany, even, because expats in Belarus appear not because Western companies come to Belarus, but because Belarusian companies go headhunting internationally to address their own challenges and bridge their own gaps. So this is probably the biggest obstacle. We should not also forget that many companies, many Belarusian companies that export rather actively were built on the basis of the investment that was made during Soviet times into the military complex. It was a good thing that in Belarus we were just producing electronics, optical instruments and software for the military and not just guns. But since then the investment into research and development remained stagnant, and that's probably another biggest problem.
Thank you very much. I'd like to respond to Mr. Trifonov's question about civil society. I'd like to address this from the point of view of the United Nations, which is perhaps not the way we normally think about civil society, but I think it's maybe useful in this context. Before Kofi Annan became the Secretary General of the United Nations in the 1990s, civil society really was not very actively involved with the United Nations, either globally or in individual countries. The United Nations was an intergovernmental agency that governments talked to each other through. During the course of his roughly 8 years as Secretary General, Kofi Annan brought civil society into the United Nations and fundamentally changed the way it works. From a political perspective, it made possible for civil society organizations to bring the United Nations to the attention of the citizens of the world and make it seem much more accessible. But from a technical perspective, it also made possible to have civil society generate a lot of ideas, analysis, and perform advocacy roles that in some sense made the United Nations jobs easier. In other ways, it complicated it. And I think you can see the same dynamic at work in any given country. And the dynamic that I described in the United Nations affected all the member states of the United Nations, countries that might be described as very democratic, and countries that might be described as otherwise. They all felt their work at the United Nations, all of them was affected by this. Now, when we go to the national level, what we see is that in many countries, that the work of civil society and government is fraught with political tensions. There's a lot of reasons for this, but this need not be the case. There are certain technical issues and aspects of governments working with civil society that are extremely important, and both governments and civil society organizations ignore these lessons at their own peril. And if they're managed well, civil society can be very useful for governments in virtually any country. For example, civil society the work of civil society can be aided dramatically in terms of its ability to address its concerns to the government through institutions like platforms and other mechanisms that aggregate civil society concerns and express them in language and frameworks that are intelligible and understandable by the government in terms of the problems and policies and programs that the government itself is dealing with. So governments that are interested in having civil society platforms and civil society organizations that don't want to cooperate through civil society platforms that governments can accept do not do themselves any favors. And finally, technological change is already having a major impact on governments' relationships with civil society organizations and vice versa. There was a reference already to crowd technology, crowdsourcing. This can be an incredibly useful sort of mechanism for helping governments and civil society organizations to work together better. But it can also, this technological developments that fragment civic space, that lead to small groups of people just talking to each other through Facebook or other kinds of internet platforms, make it harder to aggregate and really capture the vox populi through civil society. So if we really want civil society to be useful and for governments, and if we want governments to take advantage of the opportunities that civil society presents, we have to be very well informed about the technological and technical changes and developments in these relationships. Thank you very much.
There is one more question which we can quickly take, actually two. Very quickly, please, so we have 3 minutes left. Yes.
I'm Mikhail Andreev. I have a question to Mr. Bakker. Yesterday you showed a chart, I mean, the chart of IMF negotiating for 25 years, the issues that were on the agenda in 1992, the issues that are on the agenda still, and I admire your persistence. Hats off to you then, for 25 years discussing the same things. Well, if you see your way as a 100-mile strip, how many miles have we already walked, or you have walked with us? What do you think? And a question to Pavel, Daneyko. You said that it's good that we did not have the wild privatization of the 90s and that we retained the state sector. I think that this is probably the surgery long overdue that is now tainting our development. Because this enormous effort put into preserving the state sector and keeping it alive is now causing even more to maintain, while its actual market value is rather low. So it's like a white elephant that is, more expensive to maintain than to own.
Thank you. And Andrei, very quickly, please.
Andrei Dmitriev, say the truth. So we work with regions so much, and there's a huge gap between Minsk and the regions. And not just about income. I mean, the totally different understanding of the agenda, of the tasks that we're faced with. Sometimes, like there are bad news and good news. Well, yes, the good news in Minsk. The people keep telling jokes that down there is no one knows anything. Very simple question to whoever. So what would be the instruments that could help close the gap given the present economic system, and what can we do to have a similar understanding of reform in Minsk and in the regions?
Let's start with Bas.
In my presentation last night, I showed that some of the issues we discuss now are the same as we discussed in the early 90s. That's true, but I also showed in my presentation that tremendous progress has been made. When in the early 90s we said there should be a larger role for the private sector, there was hardly any private sector. There is a much bigger private sector now. It may not be big enough yet, but it's certainly a lot bigger than it was. And there are some very famous private sector companies, like the one that produces the world of tanks. So the question was, from 0 to 100, how far are we now? I think a little bit more than half, and the chart yesterday showed that in terms of income, you're now in the middle of the pack in Eastern Europe. Certainly Belarus has done much better than Ukraine and Moldova, but not as good as Poland. When we talked in the early 90s about the need for a larger role of market mechanism, private sector, at that time the disagreement was not just about speed, it was also about direction. And on the side of the government, it's probably fair to say there was not really a big belief that a bigger role of the private sector was such a great idea. I think these days the main disagreements are no longer about the direction the economy should go, but more about the speed. So we have probably the same view what the economy should look in 40 years, less agreement what it should look in 12 months.
Well, that's not exactly what I said. There was no privatization. So this is not a value-based assessment. But anyway, the public sector, which is the main threat to macroeconomic stability because it requires subsidies all the time. This is also something that stands in the way of private sector development. This makes a number of resources more expensive, including labor resources, raw materials, logistics, and this makes all those possibilities to create new companies more problematic. But if we want to sustainable development, then the SOE have to be restructured and reformed. But of course, privatization is a complex issue. In Hungary, for example, that was different. In Russia, it was different, and I think both of them were unsuccessful. So there's a way to it. And this is a complex political issue, and it's hard to make decisions regarding this issue, but those decisions would have to be made. It's inevitable. Now, as far what Andrei asked, the gap between the capital and the regions, well, this is quite normal, or like for upper tier, middle tier, this is normal for any company. Well, we have to inform those at the bottom, change the CPI, and I think that this is also for the civil society, not just for the government. We have to act together.
Thank you. The panel is over, and instead of conclusions, allow me to make two reflections. One, since I started with Stiglitz, let's end with Stiglitz and his alternative view or recommendations for the United States. He says we need to strive to increase efficiency of both the private and public sector to curb corruption in both rent, right, and limit exploitations by the monopolies. And it's kind of an interesting thing because both the representatives of the international organizations as well as Stiglitz on two different region actually talks about the same thing. It's the efficiency of both private and public sector. And I think, and here the second point of reflections, I think gonna see convergence if the West will scope with the new monopolies, how to regulate the new monopolies, as well as can manage successfully the transition toward the knowledge-based economy. And these are huge tasks. And B, Belarus can move forward to strengthen the private sector, as well as move the role of the state into a regulatory instead of the control position. And also very important, scope with, as Ben mentioned, the rewriting of the European security situation. I think these are tremendous challenges, both in Belarus and on the Western world, in the United States particularly. But if we're going to see consensus, or we're going to see convergence toward the Minsk Consensus, if these tasks are going to be manageable. Thank you so much, and please join me to thanks for an excellent performance and a very rich panel. Thank you so much.